Hey, so this is my second take. I love Dark of all trades, so me doing this video is not dogging on him in any kind of way. He's been on my channel. I've been a guest with him on other channels. I know he's at least addressed one of my videos on here, so this is not a diss against him. That being said, maybe 85% of this video is great. He does a really good job of countering, of explaining, of doing his own kind of counter apologetics, and goes against the usual fallacies, that kind of thing. But there's like 3 questions that he answers that are just bad answers. One of them's later on in the video. I'm not really going to get into it here, but from about the 13-minute mark till about the 15-minute mark, his answers just go to pot. I don't know if he took a break and he forgot to have a snack, if he needed to have a beer or have a tea or have some water, but his answers just fall apart for the next 2-3 minutes. So that's what I'm going to be covering right now. He kind of dropped the ball here, and I feel it's my job to pick up the ball and hit it right back. You know what I mean? Okay.
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
So let me talk about that answer to general atheist objections. I believe this guy's called something Zoomer. Redeemed Zoomer, maybe. So, yes, all of these objections and questions and apparent contradictions have been known about from the beginning. The very first Christian commentaries, whether it's Origen, John Christensen, Jerome, all these things are addressed and there are answers out there and available. But to go back to my recent video answering a less informed atheist, not everyone has always had universal access to the church fathers or to the more rare and obscure documents chronicling the development of theology. So to act like it's common knowledge is unfair and uncharitable. That being said, Dark does have the availability to get these resources. I believe he is actually a legitimate professor. Okay. But there is continual need for apologetics and continual need for theology and for the study of the philosophy of religion. Those things exist. People do still have questions. Every time someone comes to the Bible for the first time, they're coming with pretty much the same questions and they're getting the same general answers. And sometimes those answers aren't satisfying and they got to go a little bit deeper. And sometimes that quest to go deeper turns people into professors or theologians or YouTube people. Anyway, so you saying that, oh, but all this has been answered before. Well, everything's been answered before. There's nothing new under the sun. And every time someone comes to it for the first time, it is new to them. Stan Lee has this great philosophy, and it's why the comics were doing so well under him, is that treat every issue like it's someone's first issue. You have to explain the baseline stuff. You don't have to spend an hour doing it. You don't have to spend pages doing it, but in that front page, in that first column, catch them up. Get the origin out of the way, get the recent events, and get the main driving event for the new plot, for the new story. Just get those things out of the way. Whatever happened in the very previous issue, acknowledge it, move on. Same thing here. Every Bible is potentially someone's first Bible. It's just how it is. So these questions are going to come up, as they always do. And it's not as if there's only one answer to these things. Origen's answers are different than John Christensen. Christensen's answers are different than Augustine's. Augustine's answers are different than Aquinas's. Aquinas's answers are different than Chesterton's. Chesterton's answers are different than MacArthur's. MacArthur's answers are different than James White's. So it's not as if there's just one answer. Yeah, there's a limited number of possible correct answers. True. As my studying shows, there's 5 different answers for every question in the Bible. Okay, fine. So there's a limit of 5, but there's so many passages in the Bible that to the outside viewer and to the skeptic are the cynical. Those answers can seem infinite because of the variability and because of the different perspectives people are coming from. Now that I nuanced the hell out of that, let's get to my problem with Dark's answer.
Confusing plot twist in a soap opera can be explained with a little understanding of daytime drama. It's all about divine plot twists and spiritual character development. Really, this is post hoc rationalization at its finest.
This is not post hoc rationalization. So if you go back to the original commentaries, whether you go back to the Jewish, what the rabbinical fathers, what they're sometimes called, but go back to the Rashi, go back to the Rambam, Go back to the Shamash, just different collections and different commentaries, whether they're Talmudic, whether they're other Kabbalistic understandings, mystical Judaism, or more rooted in literalism, Judaism. However you want to look at it, there are answers there that have been established. It's not post hoc rationalization. Same thing with the Christians. The Christians' earliest commentaries are very near to when the Bible was first turned into manuscript, after the oral tradition had been established, after the writings themselves had become more concrete. These commentaries start popping up, and the Orthodox commentaries, the commentaries that are part of the Christian tradition or the Christian corpus, exist for a reason, and they have these answers. So it's fallacious to act as if these answers don't exist and to act as if they don't matter, because they have informed Christian thinking and Christian theology up to this day. Even for those that don't know that they're referencing these people, when they use those answers, that's where those answers originate from. Okay.
If there appears to be a contradiction, it can be explained by changing the meaning of something to mean something else. There is no way to determine in the Bible what should be taken literally and what is allegory or metaphor.
Me and Dark have argued about this before in a very friendly manner, but there is very clear indications when it's being allegorical. Usually it'll start off by setting off an impossibility. There's light before sun, something like that. Then from the impossibility, it'll then give you a counterfactual. Let's say a prince and an empire existing at a time when it shouldn't, or an animal that doesn't exist at that time period being present. These anomalies, these anachronisms are presented so that way the reader has context clues that what you're about to read is not literal. And as someone who has studied biblical development and has viewed the Bible through literature, not through religious perspectives, who has studied the Bible as literature and has studied the Bible as philosophy, you and I both agree that the oldest parts of the Bible are written after the exile, after the return, or during the return from Babylon to Jerusalem, when they find those older law codes and they then try to reinterpret what was there before, and new writing happens. Me and you both agree that's most likely that new writing is Genesis, is Exodus. So if we're agreeing there, you using this argumentation puts you in bad faith, because you and I both agree these are written after these time periods. They're not actually written by Bronze Age or Stone Age men. They're not written by the actual desert wanderers, unless you want to talk about walking on an established highway from Babylon or Assyria to Jerusalem as being wandering through the desert.
People used to take the Bible entirely literally, and there are still some today, but these are few and far between.
So the original commentaries on the Bible, whether Hebrew, whether Christian, whether Koine Greek, or Latin, none of them take the Bible 100% literally. And even John Christensen, who tries to hold to the most literal interpretation of the ancient writers, spends homilies, I can't say chapters because they were homilies, but he spends homilies explaining how it's not 100% literal, and how taking a 100% literal interpretation bastardizes the text and damages not only your faith, but the faith of someone who's trying to understand it. Because when they see that inconsistency or incongruity with reality, it will break their faith or damage their trust in the word. These are the earliest commentaries are explaining this. So you're being uncharitable.
When we see something that is demonstrably false, Christians have to change the meaning from literal to allegorical in order to try to justify why this incorrect passage is actually correct, but we're just reading it wrong. These people assume the Bible is true and do back-breaking gymnastics to try to keep it that way, rather than just admitting that maybe these Iron Age men don't have knowledge that we have today. And we're just trying their best to make sense of things at best, and manipulating people for their own gain at worst. 0 for 7.
The Gospels were anonymous.
Okay, so this next one we're about to get to is the second one that he just misses. But he has 2 strikes in a row. And I'm not sure why, because me and him have come to terms on these. And I've seen him come to terms with these propositions. I think that's the word I'm going to use. With other Christian and Catholic and deistic, I guess, YouTubers and TikTokers. So I don't know why he's acting as if he hasn't already come to these conclusions himself unless he was either being dishonest with us in an attempt to be polite, or if after he agreed each time, if maybe he inside then became unconvinced after a little bit of rationalizing. I don't know, but let's do this.
Doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
This may be true, but that does mean we don't know who actually wrote them. And to express that we have early church fathers who claim that they knew who wrote the Gospels is not conclusive at all. Papias, an early Christian bishop and writer, is often cited in discussions about the authorship of the Gospels. He mentioned Mark as the interpreter of Peter and claimed that Matthew compiled sayings of Jesus in Hebrew. However, his statements are somewhat ambiguous and have led to various interpretations. The point of saying the Gospels are anonymous is multifaceted. Chiefly, recognizing the Gospels as anonymous texts can influence how scholars and readers interpret them. It may lead to a focus on understanding the communities and theological concerns that shape the narratives rather than assuming a direct link to the apostles or eyewitnesses.
Now, when if I'm remembering correctly, me and him do have a slight difference in the understanding of the development of the New Testament when it comes to authorship. I ascribe to the schools theory. It's sometimes also called the group theory. So basically, different schools are the authors for each group. So there's a school for John, a Jonian school, there's a Pauline school, by the way. They most likely would have written the pseudographical letters of Paul. They wouldn't really have written the Gospels. But anyway, the Johannian comes from the Johannian tradition, or the Johannian school. The Marcian comes from the Marcian tradition, or the Marcian school. And Matthew comes from the Matthean school, or the Matthean tradition. And that's how they develop. The idea being that the attribution comes from the claim that the first people to recite these stories were either from that school or these particular individuals. And if it's these particular individuals, then they were eyewitnesses. And then they spoke the story. The story got spread around in their community, in their church. And eventually, as they started to age out, or as martyrdom came in, the people who were literate in these schools would have wrote it down. That doesn't mean they wrote it down in Jerusalem. If Mark was, I'm using Mark as a generic here. You can use any disciple. If Mark was preaching in Rome, then it would have been written in Rome. If he was speaking in Turkey, it would have been in Turkey, or Antioch, or I forget what it was called, Asia Minor. Either in Asia Minor or Ephesus, Alexandria. So where all these texts would come from. Now, Alexandria has a school that is said to be founded by one of the apostles. So that school and that school of thought is what's going to end up being Origen style apologetics and understanding and commentary, which is going to be the more spiritual understanding. You have another school going on in Antioch, which is going to be more Petrine, and they're going to have a more literal interpretation and a more anti-Jewish leaning eventually in their development of their schooling and study of the Gospels. And these communities would preserve their gospel, their copy, which again, they're saying it goes back to a specific apostle. Now, the students of students had traditions about who wrote the gospel that they themselves were in possession of. And so since their student was a student of an apostle, or was the grand student of an apostle, or in that line, that tradition of where that schooling came from, of where that good news came from, is going to be where they attribute it to. So they're attributing to a school and to a tradition based on the story that school has about who either wrote it or who was dictating it, and then someone notated it. And in that scribal process, in the manuscript process, that's how that attribution happened. And you'll see this not just with Papias, but you'll see this with almost all of the early commentators and early church fathers. They'll give a brief history of each gospel and how it came to be. Some of the stories match up really well, some of them don't. Some of the martyrdom stories match up really well with history, some of them don't. But what you end up having is you have the apostles being sent out after Jesus' death, and they all end up in different places. Now, some of these authorships and foundings of churches, or sees, as they will eventually be called, does get a little tenuous. So, Peter and Paul are the founders of the Roman Church because they were martyred there. I believe it's Thomas, becomes the founder of the church in Spain because after his martyrdom, his body is dug up and they ship the head to Spain, and where they bury the head, they end up building a church there. That's how he's the founder of the church in Spain. I believe it's Thomas. It could be a different one. And you get these stories that not only document, I guess would be the right word, the history of how the gospel came to be and try to give a string of legitimacy to the original authorship or to the attributorship, but also with that you get the story of how that particular apostle died, and you get the story of all 12 of what they did, where they preached, what churches they founded, what schools they founded, and how they were martyred. So most of these stories agree. There's like one or two that don't, and it's only like with one or two apostles that it gets a little murky, but that's what that is. That's where we're getting these traditions. It's called sacred tradition or holy tradition, and these traditions develop with the church. So Dark's just discounting all of that. But me and Dark are not disagreeing on that the texts were all written originally in Koine Greek, that they were written in different parts of the world other than Jerusalem. So there's that. The epistles are written first, then the Gospels, and very last is going to be written Revelation or the Apocalypse. And the order of the Gospels, most people want to say Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, and then finally John. Others will say that Matthew is first, then Mark, then Luke, and then John. That's why they're in that order. It just depends on which tradition you're looking at, and there's secular traditions and religious traditions, but most of them agree that Mark is either the first one or he's taking notes on the other two. Anyway.
We don't know who wrote the Gospels, and if they were not written by people who actually knew this Mr. Jesus, then how much stock do you think historians are willing to put into them? How much stock should you put into them if this were the case? Anonymous means that the identity of the person who actually wrote them is unknown.
So again, this is such an uncharitable way to word it. Here's what we know. We know that whoever physically wrote them were literate in Greek. To be fair, there's one that's written really poorly. But at least when we get to John, we know he's literate in Greek. We also know that Matthew, his Greek is good. So you know that they're Greek speakers and that they're writing in Greek. You know that they're Christians. You know that when these things are written, it can't be before the letters of Paul, because Paul writes before the Gospels. So you have a time period of something between 38 and 70. You know it has to be before 70, before the fall of the temple. So that's your time frame. So after 33, because you have to go after the death of Jesus, and you have to go after the epistles, so maybe even after 40. So you have a time frame, you have a location, you know they're Christians, you know they're at least literate in Greek. Now, it is possible that all four of these gentlemen, after all there were 12, four of them could have learned Greek from the time of Jesus' death to the time of the fall of the temple. Totally possible that between their commission and between their martyrdom, they learned Greek. That is actually possible. I don't know why people act like that's impossible. On the other hand, let's say they were dictating to a scribe. That's still completely possible. I don't know why gentlemen, even people like Bart Ehrman, who agree that this had been done, say that it's a high improbability. I don't get that. Okay, so you don't have tons of records of people doing that in a different language. Okay, but it does happen. It had happened. There are communications between different countries where the paper's written in one language and in a different language, or where there's an interpreter on the other side. That was already going on. So I don't know why it's so controversial, other than to simply put a theory out there that catches attention and you get a book published. So I don't think this is a very strong objection. There are probable ways that the original attributorship can be true, and even if that initial dictation to a scribe is not the origination of the oral tradition, the oral tradition would still go back to the apostle and to the school or the church that they founded. So I don't see a problem there. When looking at Native American stories and tribal stories in Africa, we don't scrutinize the attribution. We don't scrutinize the authorship in this way. So we know that it's from a certain tribe or from a certain group or from a certain community, and that's usually good enough. So if a Johannine community is the one who wrote it, that's good enough. So I don't know who this objection is objecting to. Are you objecting to the church that didn't put titles on these books? Are you objecting to the people who started putting these titles just to keep them organized? So they knew this is from this school or this tradition and this is from that school or that tradition. Are you scrutinizing the people who compiled the text? or compiled the Bible? Are you scrutinizing the Protestants who then put numbers and organized these books into a certain form? Is that the problem? Is that there's an apocryphal story about the guy riding on a horse and doing it, in 3 days and getting it slightly wrong, and that happens way after the founding of Christianity. That's happens, after the Protestant Revolution. So I don't know. I don't know who exactly this criticism is meant to critique. It doesn't have anything to do with the faith. It doesn't have anything to do with the validity of the texts themselves. In one of the first videos me and him interacted with, I asked the question, okay, so let's say there's no authorship attributed to these works. Does that change the value of the words if they're true? And he agreed, no. So I don't see who this criticism is for, other than to just counter someone that you don't like.
That is different from saying we have no idea who wrote them. We have suspicions, sure, but you don't actually know if the persons you think did wrote the books or not. Your guess holds the same weight as having no idea. 0 for 8 now.
I don't agree with that at all. Like I said, there's 2 other questions that he doesn't hit out of the park, but at least he hits the ball. With these 2, he misses altogether. But there are 2 other questions that he doesn't hit him out of the park. And both of those, I think he has kind of the same attitude that he has here with this answer, where he's overgeneralizing and it becomes dismissive and it becomes uncharitable. You wouldn't go to other works and use this of uncharity when examining it. So countering the truth value of a claim because you don't know who originally made the claim, that is itself a fallacy. It's a detractor. It's just distraction. So I don't know what he's trying to get at with that. And like I said, he does that with 2 other ones that at least he hits the ball. This one, he just misses completely. So these are the 2 biggest mistakes in the video. There's at least 2 other questions where, like I said, he doesn't hit them out of the park. They're foul balls, but at least he hits the ball. You know what I mean? And then everything else, he does a really good job for the majority of the video, and I recommend watching the whole video. Don't take this critique of these 2 bad responses as a dismissal of Dark, because Dark's great. I just think he's wrong in his approach to these 2 objections. All right, peace.